Hi, I'm Lisa Kudrow. I'm glad you're here today. Mental health care and education is important to me. That's why I chose to become involved at UCLA, joining the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors and emceeing the galas and #WOW, the Wonder of Women Summit. I'm so excited that WOW and UCLA's Friends of Semel Institute Open Mind have joined together to bring outstanding, free virtual programs about mental health issues. This means you will hear conversations on the intersection of culture and science between renowned authors and filmmakers who share their personal stories and world-class UCLA scientists that highlight the latest in mental health research, care, and progress. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Open Mind WOW series and hope to see you at many more programs.
Hi, I'm Vicki Goodman, and I too would like to welcome you to today's Open Mind program, sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, and WOW, the Wonder of Women. For those of you with us for the first time, the Open Mind brings together thought leaders in science and culture to present programs about mental health issues as a free public service to the community. Prior to the coronavirus era, these programs were held in person at UCLA, but now we have pivoted to this Zoom platform. And the silver lining is that we now have people joining us from all over the country, and even some international viewers from as far away as Israel, Spain, and France. A huge thank you to Lisa Kudrow for her warm welcome and for her dedication to supporting mental health education, clinical care, and research at UCLA. We are honored to have Dr. Daniel Siegel here with us today to talk about his latest book, The Power of Showing Up: How Parental Presence Shapes Who Our Kids Become and How Their Brains Get Wired, which he co-authored with Dr. Tina Payne Bryson. Based on the latest brain and scientific attachment research, The Power of Showing Up is an important and groundbreaking guide to cultivating your child's healthy emotional landscape. It is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Siegel back to the Open Mind for his 5th appearance. Now, if this was Saturday Night Live, Dr. Siegel would receive a special jacket for being a 5-time host. While we can't offer that, we can and do offer our sincere gratitude to him for always graciously accepting our invitations to speak and share his knowledge and expertise with our audience. Dr. Siegel is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He's also the executive director of the MindSight Institute, which focuses on the development of mindsight and teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel has published extensively for both the professional and lay audiences. His 5-time New York Times bestsellers are Aware, The Science and Practice of Presence, Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human, Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, and several books with Tina Payne Bryson, The Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline, The Yes Brain, and the book he is here to talk about today, The Power of Showing Up. His other books include The Developing Mind, The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, MindSight, The Mindful Brain, and The Mindful Therapist. Dr. Siegel also serves as the founding editor for the Norton Professional Series on interpersonal neurobiology, which currently contains over 70 textbooks. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program is being taped. So if your friends and family or colleagues were not able to join us today, they will have the opportunity to watch the program again on the Friends of Semel website, www.friendsofthesemelinstitute.org, which also takes you to our YouTube channel. While you're there, please check out some of our other past videos and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that we can continue to build up our audience. Our program will run for 1 hour. Everyone's Zoom has been automatically placed on mute, but you will have a chance to ask Dr. Siegel questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the time allotted. So now please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Daniel Siegel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki. That was really beautiful. And thank you all for being here. I'd like to really extend a deep bow of appreciation to all the work that Friends of Semel does. And in bringing these out, as Lisa Kudrow says, the interface of culture and science is so important. It's never been more important than right now in our lives. So I'm going to try to tailor some of these remarks I make about attachment and about the power of showing up, the book that is featured in today's talk that I wrote with Tina Payne Bryson, with what's going on right now in terms of the pandemic that is all around our planet, in terms of the fires that are all around the West Coast of the United States, and in terms of the racial injustice that is being revealed after hundreds of years of systemic racism being a part of the United States. All of these basically are issues very much related to how human beings have shown up or not for one another, how they've shown up or not for their relationship, not only to other people who are not like them, but also to species not like them and our relationship with Earth. So we begin, as Vicki mentioned, with the framework that I'll be speaking from is called Interpersonal Neurobiology. And it was born in a building that no longer exists on the seafloor, which is the sea level, not the ocean bottom of NPI, when I was the acting training director in child and adolescent psychiatry. And there's a long story behind it, but I'll just say that bringing all the different scientists from UCLA and other areas together, we addressed the question of what is the mind and what is a healthy mind? How does the mind relate to the brain? And how can we, in the various fields of science, including anthropology, sociology, linguistics, psychology, medicine, and other fields of biology, including neuroscience and genetics, chemistry, physics, and even math, how can we, and there was a collection of 40 academics, address this question of what is the mind, how does it relate to the brain? And so that became a journey, you know, back in the early 90s, the beginning of the decade of the brain. So everything I'm going to share with you, and the other 4 times that Vicki was mentioning that I've been privileged to be a part of the Open Mind series, you know, have all come from this field of interpersonal neurobiology. So if you're listening and you're an academic, fantastic, and you want to see the academic basis of what I'm going to say, The Developing Mind 3rd edition is a recent publication from Guilford Press. You're welcome to dive into those 500 pages and the thousands of references that are there. I then translate that science, that what's called consilience, that view across all these disciplines, for various fields, such as the field of education or the field of mental health or the field of parenting or the field of, you know, the way governments function. And in all these applications, you'll find ways of actually having useful applications of the science. And before I forget, and before we get into the power of showing up, I just want to make sure I mention to you that in terms of this notion of culture meets science, we have a weekly meeting called the Pep Meetings, which initially was the personal experience, PE, of the planetary pandemic, PP. But then it got transformed as the pandemic went on and on and on to the personal exploration of planetary possibility. And I invite all of you to come to our Friday at 1 o'clock in California meetings because what we do is we gather together as a community to basically ask the question, how can we as a human culture take the foundations of science to use this moment in human history of the disruption of lives and livelihoods so that we don't go back to business as usual, and instead imagine the possibilities of a world that could be, and perhaps even a world that should be, and then take the steps building on the foundation of science to create such a world. And that's the community, we call it a MWE community, me plus we equals MWE. The simple notion that we are more than just our bodies, we're more than just our brains and our heads, we're as much our relationships with one another as we are these embodied creatures. And to live that integrated way, integration being the linking of differentiated parts, is a way we can actually think about moving forward instead of the excessively differentiated way that makes us think we're not interconnected, so we're at risk of pandemics. So we're not interconnected, so we're at risk of dehumanizing people and creating castes where the marginalized groups are basically not treated as full citizens. And even the way we are excessively differentiated, not interconnected with nature, which can be understood as the cause of the climate change that is in part responsible for the incredibly mind-boggling 5 million acres that have burned in the last month in the West Coast. So please come join us, because there's never been a time like now when we need science to meet culture and build bridges across all sorts of ways that we can be of service to the world. So I invite you all to come join us. So the power of showing up basically is what Tina Payne Bryson, who when originally was a student of mine and then became a colleague and then became a co-author and a co-teacher, a wonderful, wonderful professional. She got her doctoral degree in social work. And so together, we were studying interpersonal neurobiology and its way of looking at how to raise kids. She had first a 6-month-old when she first became my student, when I was co-running the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development at UCLA. And then she began really showing these incredible gifts at being a teacher, had a second child and a third child. So she was raising all her kids with these principles of interpersonal neurobiology applied. She knew my 2 kids who are now adults. And so it was really fun to kind of compare notes, and we decided to write what is ultimately now our 4th book for parents. And the power of showing up basically allows you to not only see what attachment research informs us about what the science of relationships says is the best chance we can give from ourselves as parents to our kids, but also it looks at very practical applications of what to do about that. And I'm going to walk you through those practical applications right now in our time together, and then we'll have time for discussion. So let's talk about what this is all about. So first, some background. In the field of psychology, and at UCLA, my mentor was Marian Sigman, who is a professor of psychology and psychiatry at our wonderful university, a part of NPI, the Neuropsychiatric Institute. And Marian taught me, as did Chris Heineke, another psychologist in the field. Sadly, both of them have now passed. But they were my mentors who taught me that you can look deeply at relationships and begin to understand how people's lives unfolded due to the experience in those relationships. So at the same time, I was being trained to be first an adult psychiatrist and a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And when I decided under Marian's supervision to apply for a National Institute of Mental Health research training grant and received it, it was to study different aspects of how the mind develops based on the mind of the parent, studying something called the narrative or the story, the life story of a person. And that introduced me and developed relationships to the field of attachment research. So attachment science is a branch of psychology, but in the popular literature, you'll see people use the attachment term that actually are not drawing on the science of attachment. And it's a free country in America. You can use words however you want to use them. So be very careful that even if you see a parenting approach that uses the word attachment, the ones I've seen at least are actually not grounded in the science of attachment. So what is this science of attachment? John Bowlby, a psychiatrist, and Mary Ainsworth, a psychologist, joined forces and years ago in the 60s, developed this approach to understanding how the experiences children have with their caregivers will shape things like how they regulate their emotions, how they learn to connect with other people, how they learn basically to have what's called self-regulation. And what Mary Ainsworth, as a research psychologist, was able to do with the help of her graduate student, Mary Main, was to figure out in Baltimore some fundamental ways where there were patterns of attachment. Patterns of attachment means you could study ways that parents communicate with children and then study how those children turn out a couple years later. And now one of my colleagues, Alan Sroufe, S-R-O-U-F-E, an emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota, has the longest study, a longitudinal study, where the parents that were studied before the child was born, these were pregnant couples, those kids that then were born subsequent to the beginning of the study are now in their mid-40s. So he's been able to show with his colleagues that the pattern of communication you have with your primary attachment figure actually shapes how you live your life for at least 4 decades of living. Now that's mind-blowing. And one of his colleagues and my teacher, Mary Main, was the graduate student of Mary Ainsworth in Baltimore, and then went to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, where she still is, became a professor of psychology there. And Mary Main, who taught me, developed with her colleagues at Berkeley the instrument called the adult attachment interview, which basically is a way of asking parents, hey, what do you remember about your childhood? And then in a systematic way, you can study how the way they respond, not so much what they say, but how they say it. So the nature of the narrative is actually the most robust predictor of the child's security of attachment, which falls into different categories. And that's what Alan Sroufe could follow into the mid-40s. So let me say that again. It turns out that these different patterns of attachment that we can develop with our primary caregiver, and just a parenthetic comment, we have something called Aloe Parenting, which means as human beings, we share our child caring with other adults. And that's very unusual for a mammal to do this. So mammals have attachment, and we share that attachment responsibility, that ability to take care of a child who attaches to us. So we say we bond to the child, but the child attaches to us. We try not to say the phrase, the adult is attached to the kid, because that would be actually reverse parenting. So we're bonded to our children, but our children can be attached to more than one adult, basically, and that's called Aloe Parenting. And there's a beautiful book called Mothers and Others by Sarah Hrdy, H-R-D-Y, that allows you to actually see the science of Aloe Parenting. And it's not just an interesting aspect of our history, it's actually a pivotal moment in our evolution when we had to be collaborative. So I say that to you because a lot of people maybe hearing a talk like this will say it's only up to the mother. Well, actually, no. Biologically, we evolved to share child rearing with a few selective, what are called attachment figures. So what the researchers do, though, is they study the primary attachment relationship, but the other attachment relationships are also significant. But for statistical purposes, they're looking at the primary attachment figure, the one you spend the most time with as a kid. And then what we can show is that that security for 65% of the population, or various forms of non-secure attachment, which is roughly about a third, those fall into 3 different groupings. Insecure avoidant, which I call non-secure because people think it means the person's insecure, but it doesn't. It's just a research term. So non-secure avoidant, non-secure ambivalent, and then an overlapping group for statistical reasons, non-secure disorganized. So we can actually study those 3 non-secure groupings and ask the question, what happened in the way the parents were interacting with their children that led to these very clear categories that then you could follow on into now the mid-40s. And it turns out that you might say, well, it's what happened to the parent, and it's not the full answer. It turns out it's how the parent has made sense of his or her early childhood experiences and how they've impacted them. And that falls into some fascinating ways of looking at the narrative, which we won't get into here. But let me just say that with my daughter's preschool director, Mary Hartzell, who also sadly passed away, Mary and I wrote a book called Parenting from the Inside Out, which makes available to you a way of taking these narrative findings and then making sense of your own life. So I would never have written any of the various parenting books that I have written unless I wrote that book first, wrote it with Mary. And the books I've written with Tina Payne Bryson are all basically taking that view and saying, okay, once you've made sense of your life, what does that really mean? So in our fourth book, This Power of Showing Up, this is the fourth book, what we've come to is some fundamental statements. Now I'm going to teach you the take-home messages based on all the science I just said, that if you want your child to have the most chance of being resilient in life, and these principles that we're about to go over are incredibly useful during the pandemic. So a lot of talks I give these days, are all about what are we supposed to do as parents? What are we supposed to do as educators during the pandemic with physical distancing? Let's drop the term social distancing because we should not be socially distanced. Yes, we have to be physically distanced, wear masks, don't share our air, the saying goes. Yes, physical distancing, but don't be socially disconnected because we're incredibly social creatures. As Matt Lieberman and colleagues at UCLA have beautifully shown with Naomi Eisenberger, we are social beings. And even the experience of rejection, Naomi and Matt have shown, is associated with activation of parts of the brain the same as if we were physically injured when we're socially rejected. So social disconnection is painful, and we need to keep social connection while maintaining physical distance. So let's put that into our culture. Okay, fortunately, we have a pathway so we can see that if you want to develop resilience at a time of the pandemic, at a time of these raging fires, at a time of social injustice and unrest, at a time of political upheaval, what do you do? So I can say that one of the simplest ways of remembering everything I'm about to say is with the single word, which is kind of like in The Graduate, when Dustin Hoffman is, pulled aside in the party at the beginning of the film, and they say, I want to give you the clue what your future would be like. And so Dustin Hoffman goes, what? And he goes, plastics. So this is that kind of moment, only this is the real thing, although maybe plastics would have been a good thing to invest in, although not for the world. It's actually a bad thing to invest in. So what is it? It's presence. There's no such thing as parental perfection. We can aim in a certain direction, but we cannot be perfect, but we can strive to be present. So the term showing up simply means how you come to your parenting, especially during a time of pandemic, with presence. Now, in one of my open mind gatherings with all of you here, we talked about the book Aware. So if you say, how do I develop presence? You can do parenting from the inside out from a parenting approach, but the Aware book takes you step by step through the science of presence and the art of cultivating it in your life. So that book is available to you, and we've already talked about it. So here what I want to say is, when we look at attachment research, the science of relationships between youth and their caregivers, what we can say is it's the presence of the attachment figure, the parent, the grandparent, the uncle, the aunt, the significant other who's shaping the child's development. It's their presence. And it shows up in the book, we made it really 3 S's that build a 4th S. So we're going to talk about these S's, but I want you to listen carefully because there's actually a 5th S in there. that it just didn't quite fit the way we wanted it to. So we put it in there, but we didn't make it its own S. So those of you who know my other teachings, whatever, I'm kind of a nut for acronyms. This isn't exactly an acronym, but it's a mnemonic. So one of my first teachers at UCLA, Gary Small, Gary, if you're on, I hope you'd be happy with this, that it's a mnemonic that lets you remember these S's. So these S's are all about presence. They're all about showing up. I guess that's another S too, but that's not the fifth one that I want you to watch for. All right, so let's go through them one by one. And again, if you're a parent listening to this, please remember, there's no such thing as perfect parenting. And if you've read any of the books I've written on parenting, I always put my flub ups where I've goofed up, and to my own children or now adults' dismay, I go, why do you make that public that you can be such a jerk? And I go, because people should know there's no such thing as perfect parenting. And as my friend and colleague Ed Tronick has shown, and he has a beautiful book with a colleague called The Power of Discord, Ed Tronick has shown that it's really about repair of ruptures. That even though I'm going to give you sort of a guideline on what the research says we ought to aim for, no one does it perfectly. We always goof up. But when we goof up, to take note of that goof up, take a deep breath, be kind to yourself, and then move toward your child when they're ready, or your adolescent, or your spouse, or even yourself, and then make a reconnection. So when there's a disconnection, make a reconnection. When there's a rupture, make a repair. However you want to phrase it, the idea is to forgive and not forget, but to move forward. There's a bunch of F's, that allow you to really bring the relationship back into alignment. I like to remember the acronym PART, P-A-R-T. Your presence, the P, allows you to do something called attunement, the A. What's attunement? It's focusing your attention on the internal life of the other, or even of yourself. So that's attunement. I made up a word. I remember when I was in medical school in the late 70s, I was just so disturbed by how unempathic and uncompassionate my professors were. So this wasn't at UCLA, it was in the East Coast, well, it was at Harvard. And, someone's saying, we couldn't hear you. Is that true? Can you not hear me anymore? Have you lost me? Someone write me a note that you can hear me. I don't know who's writing me that note. Dan, we couldn't hear you. Never mind. Okay, good. Well, that's a great example. We want to have feedback with each other and be with each other. So thanks. If something else happens, I'll try to watch for that as best I can and see that. So the idea here, though, is that when I dropped out of school because people weren't compassionate, I remember coming back. I actually met with Jolly West because my girlfriend at the time, her, let's see, how did it work? Her landlord was a social worker that knew Kay West. And so she got in touch with Kay, who got in touch with Jolly, who brought me into his office, who said, yeah, come here and all this stuff. And it was a very exciting moment, but it was like 1980. And I remember, when I decided to go back to school and get my degree, I made up this word mindsight for trying to understand why the professors back in Boston somehow didn't see the subjective experience of their patients. So I made up this word mindsight, went back and ultimately came back to pediatrics under Eileen Yeager, and Joel Yeager was her husband. And then we was at parties. And anyway, Joel said, I keep on noticing you're hanging out with the psychiatry residents. So Joel kind of wooed me over and I switched over from pediatrics to psychiatry under Jolly. That's a lot of history just to say that the word mindsight is what allows you to be attuned, the A of part. So attunement requires that you focus attention on the reality of subjectivity, someone's feelings, someone's imagery, the meaning of their life, the meaning when someone has an illness, or if it's your child, the meaning of the pandemic for them, so that you're tuning into what's actually going on with them. Okay, so the A is attunement, the R is resonance, that you allow in your presence, this attunement to be there, but resonance is where you're actually changed by your child. You feel their feelings, which means you have to have a big enough awareness. I like to compare it to like a container of water, so that you want to build your container really, really big, so that, let's say, your child's distress about the pandemic, or about social injustice, or about the smoke from all these fires, 5 million acres of our beautiful West Coast have just been obliterated. To feel the weight of that, to feel the weight of all of the Black individuals who've been murdered in just the last couple of months, to feel the weight of that, to feel the weight of the injustice of people who are marginalized, having a much higher chance of getting the novel coronavirus and dying of COVID-19, just to feel the weight of that. We need a container of awareness that isn't just the size of an espresso cup. So if those incredible injustices in the world and pains in the world are like a tablespoon of salt, if our awareness is just the size of an espresso cup, you put it in, it's overwhelming. You cannot drink that water in an espresso cup. So we want to learn techniques to expand the size of the container of awareness. So in the analogy, we get the same injustice. We see it in the newspaper. We see it online. We are aware of these things. But now our container is 100 gallons in size. So the same injustice then comes to us, and you mix it up, a tablespoon of salt and 100 gallons of water, you can hold it. So we can resonate with that in an empathic way and a compassionate way. And the difference between empathy and compassion is that empathy has 5 components. It allows you to feel another's feelings, take on their perspective, their point of view, have cognitive understanding of what's going on with them, take joy in their success, empathic joy, and then have empathic concern. So when you do detect suffering, like we're feeling right now on the planet, then that 5th aspect of empathy, so empathic resonance, feeling another's feelings, perspective taking on their perspective, cognitive understanding, really understanding what it's like as best you can. It's an approximation, but you try. With mindset, you try. Joy in other people's success and happiness, empathic joy. And then empathic concern is then the gateway for now a different process, different in our experience of it, different in the way we carry it out, different even in the brain, called compassion. And compassion is where you take that empathic sense of another's suffering, your concern, so that's empathic concern, with all the other aspects of empathy there. And now you say, number 1, I sense your suffering. Number 2, I'm wondering what I could do to reduce your suffering. Number 3, you carry out the act, even if it's bearing witness and being with someone in their pain. So I say all this because empathy and compassion are a part of this resonance of part. And when you are present, attune, and resonate, you have this large container of awareness because you have this presence, and you develop T, trust. So the part we play is embedded in this showing up sequence that we're about to do. So here we go. Let's go through it. The first part we need to talk about part is safety, right? And safety is where we are protecting our kids from harm. And so this time of the pandemic, this time of the fires, this time of social injustice, this time of political unrest, this time of the election, with a violation of what's called epistemic trust, that is, what can you trust to be real or not in terms of what authorities are saying to you? This is a deep, deep developmental process. Epistemic trust. Epistemology is how we know what we know. And epistemic trust is when you turn to your attachment figure originally, and you turn to them, you say, as a kid, basically, you don't use these words, but this is what it is. Can I trust that the way you're conveying the nature of truth is accurate? So initially, we do that with our attachment figures. Then we transfer it to our teachers, who are also a kind of attachment figure, then to our close friends, then to the people we work for, And then to leaders we have of all sorts in government and in spiritual practices, we want to be able to trust that the way they're conveying truth is accurate. And there is something called science, which conveys in a disciplined way, struggling with itself and always debating itself, a way of understanding truth. Okay, so epistemic trust is also a part of this feeling of safety, but we want to protect our kids from all these different dangers that are out there. The second part of safety is that we have to be sure that as best we can, we are not the source of terror ourselves as attachment figures, because if we are, it creates in the child's brain what you can simply think of as a paradox, a biological paradox. What's the paradox? The paradox is that the deepest part of the brain, and if you make a hand model of the brain, this is excessively oversimplified, but it's a good way to start. And my wonderful daughter, Daniel Siegel, who does all the drawings in my books, she says, Dad, don't say it's a handy model of the brain, but it is quite useful. It is handy. Don't tell her I said that. Anyway, it's got this top part, the cortex. It's got the middle part, the limbic area and other regions, 2 thumbs to be a perfect model. And then you lift it up, the deepest part is the brainstem. And essentially, when we feel threatened, we want to get away, and there's a fight, flight, freeze, and faint set of reactions embedded in these deep neural networks that are about 300 million years old. And so we want to get away from the source of threat. But then the higher areas, and I review these in great detail in the Developing Mind, these higher areas say, well, I'm terrified right now. I should go toward my attachment figure to be protected. So the 200 million year old mammalian attachment networks, there's 3 of them. We won't go into all of them now, but you can read them in the Developing Mind. They say, go toward my attachment figure to be protected. Well, the deeper part of the brain is saying, going away from the attachment figure, who is the source of fear? Well, you have one body. So it's a paradox because you cannot go both toward and away from one thing, a parent. So this is why if we are ever the source of terror, it can be obviously in the extremes, abuse and neglect, called developmental trauma. But even in the less extreme situation, these are also examples of adversity, adverse childhood experiences, where there's domestic violence, or a parent is a substance abuser who comes home drunk, or you're just screaming at the top of your lungs and you look out of control. Those can also be terrifying for a kid. And even though they wouldn't be reportable as abuse, they're still terrifying for the kid, and those lead to disorganized attachment. So we need to make sure if we end up doing those things that we reduce the intensity, the frequency that we do them, and always, always, always make a repair as soon as you can. And I work even with, adult kids who have adult parents, where decades later, they work on making a repair. So it's safe to say it's never too late to make a repair, but the sooner the better. Let's just put it that way. So that's the first S, safety. Repair, 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 so important to say. Second S is seen, S-E-E-N. And this is where the internal world of our patients, I'm about to tell you about a patient, the internal world of our children is seen. And the reason my patient came up was because I actually floated back in time to NPI on the 5th floor, I remember, when I was seeing one of my first patients, long-term patients. She was a graduate student. She got better. I didn't know exactly why. So I said, we do an exit interview at UCLA. And we didn't, but I made that up. And she said, oh, great. That's a great idea. What do you do in an exit interview? I say, we talk about what worked in therapy. She says, oh, great. It's pretty obvious what worked. I said, yes, I know it's obvious. I had no idea what helped her. I said, but how would you put it into words in your terminology? She goes, well, I would say the thing that worked here was that I've never had the experience of feeling felt before. And right there on the 5th floor of NPI, the old brick building, I heard the most elegant and eloquent phrase for what relationships that are generative, that are nurturing, that are compassionate, that are connecting, that are pro-growth is all about. Feeling felt. I see her, I know her name. I can't say it, of course, because she was my patient, but I want to quote her because I didn't make up that phrase. It's her phrase. And it changed everything for me as a young resident at UCLA. Feeling felt is what we mean by being seen. So it's important for you as a parent for your child, but even in any relationship, to go beneath behavior to the subjective experience of the individual in front of you. To really look at their self. So self, if you remember the acronym SPA, it's a way of saying, what do we mean by self? Subjective experience, S, perspective, P, and A is agency. This motivational drive, this will, if you will, to get a sense of those things, of the self of this kid in front of you, beneath their behavior. And not all parents do this, but it's the core of secure attachment, is that you use your mind sight skills and develop them. And if you didn't have them when you were younger, that's fine. You can develop them at any age. As Stuart, who I talk about in a book called Mindsight, was in his 90s, was my mom's age, learned this for the first time. And his wife called me up after 65 years of marriage and said, Dan, what have you done? Have you given Stuart a brain transplant? Because you can change so much throughout the lifespan because of neuroplasticity. Okay, so seeing is so important. And when we mess up, you make a repair. What's the third S? The third S is soothe. And this is really what we've been talking about, is how do you show up for your child, be present, so that you actually can be there with them and you have a container big enough because you have presence, parental presence, right? So that their distress doesn't freak you out. And if it does, you take a little break and go away, work it out. So that if you have not, done your work, so that you can be present with the anxiety of uncertainty that COVID-19 is creating. This pandemic has now been accompanied with the racial injustice that's here and the incredible amount of violence going on in our country. The fires that are here on the West Coast. All of this stuff is overwhelming. So we need to build our container, show up for ourselves, so we're ready to, not pretend like this is unimportant, but just to be there so we can soothe. Now, before we get to security and then open it up for questions, I'll just sneak in the extra S, and I told you I would put it in there. Let's call it 3B. It's sense making. Not as beautiful as, safe and seen and soothe. Sense making, well, okay, but it's there, it's an S. So sense making means we tell stories about what's going on, even if it's a reflective dialogue that goes something like this. These are really hard times to not be in school, wearing all the masks, you don't see people's faces, being physically distanced, we don't want to be socially disconnected. These are hard times, so I feel upset, I feel anxious, and I feel really, really concerned, and I really want to be present every day as best I can, being with these different feelings. Now, notice how that felt when I said all that, compared to this. I feel fine. There's nothing going on. What's going on with you? Or something like, oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen. I read the paper today, it was so terrible. There's no, you don't know what's going to happen. Uncertainty was so bad in my childhood. Oh my God. So both are reactions of either rigidity in one hand or chaos in the other that are signs of what we call integration being impaired. So it's like a river. There's an optimal river of harmony that has 5 qualities that spell the word faces. It's flexible, adaptive, coherent means resilient over time. It's energized and it's stable. And we always kind of flow in and out sort of towards chaos on one bank outside of the river of harmony and integration, or toward the other of rigidity. So we're always kind of moving. It's never something done. But how do you create that faces flow? You create it by linking differentiated parts. We don't have time to get into it now, but let me just say that you can do that process, linking differentiated parts, which we're just going to name as integration. And so far, every study ever done shows that well-being comes from integration, whether it's relational integration or brain integration. People with impaired integration have chaos and rigidity, and every psychiatric disorder ever studied, my 18 interns that helped me revise and develop mine could not believe that they couldn't find an exception, but they couldn't. Every brain study ever done at UCLA or any other place on the planet that we could find that's been published shows impaired integration in the brain. And a study by Smith et al. In 2015 showed that if you take every measure of well-being, the one brain factor that predicts it is an integrated brain. It's called the interconnections of the connectome. So security is basically developing an integrated brain and an integrated way of living and an integrated relationships for your child. So as she or he or they go forward from infancy into toddlerhood to the preschool period to elementary school to middle school to high school and then out in the world in a job or college or whatever they're going to do, you've set them up with a solid foundation of integration that is the basis for security so that they can have mutually rewarding relationships. They can be aware of what's going on. They can be present. They have this big old container of consciousness so that whatever life dishes out as tablespoons of salt, they can not only be with them in their own inner life, but they realize they are also a relational life, that relationships are not icing on the cake. They're not even the cake. They're the main meal, that the mind is actually broader than the brain and bigger than the body, and who we are is both a me and a we. And so in our community, in these Pep meetings, we talk about a we community, me plus we, both of them are important. The me is the inner experience of your body. The we is your connection to people and the planet. And when we integrate our identity and get this broad sense of belonging, it can be seen as me plus we equals we. And we thank you for your attention, and we can open up now for our discussion. And I really appreciate being here, and thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm muted. Thank you so much, Dan. You've given us so much to think about, so much to unpack about today's world, about parenting, and a lot of food for thought here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki. Thank you.
We have a lot of wonderful questions here. I'll begin with a question from Esperanza. How is attachment affected when a newborn is forced to stay in the hospital at birth due to health and not able to bond with the mother?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And, back in the old days, everyone was really concerned, about the first few hours and the first few days. And, in attachment, what we want to look at is really the first few months and really see how we can make a connection go like that. However, because there is something called implicit memory, this memory that is being formed before the age of 18 months, we do have a kind of memory that deeply gets embedded in us. Then the more time you can spend with the baby, let's say in the NICU, and when I was in pediatrics, this was a big concern of mine, that when we had to have a baby, a newborn, in the hospital, that we would give this baby as much contact as we could. The kangaroo method is very important, making sure their body gets a lot of touch, and making sure the parents are very involved with them so that their attachment can begin. But it's important to be really kind to yourself. Things happen in life. I mean, as they say, stuff happens, so attachment is a working model. It can change over time. So you want to identify there are things like that happen. So, when I do therapy, for example, I'm always working with some of these early experiences, which we really can't put into words, but can certainly shape a feeling of fear of losing a loved one and stuff like that. So you just do the best you can. So you want to optimize your physical contact and your attunement, all these things we were talking about, being your part, even if the baby's in the hospital.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We had several questions regarding if two parents have different ways of parenting. And one is more following your guidance and doing the more empathic, safe, secure, the 4 S's. And one is more the tough love. What advice would you give?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of settings about that. I mean, one is if it's a divorce situation and the two, attachment patterns are, physically distinct in terms of households, it may be sort of out of your control as the one spouse who sees it, and you can just let the divorced spouse know about some of these things and just hope for the best. If it's actually in your presence and you're living in the same house and you're still together, I would read Parenting from the Inside Out together. I think there's more collaboration if the couple is still together, as a married, or not necessarily married, but, raising these kids together. And here's the thing to keep in mind, that kids are capable of having more than one attachment strategy that they develop, and it's specific to each parent, and amazingly specific to each parent's adult attachment interview findings. So some people say that just gives a kid more resilience, assuming it's not a terrifying set of experiences, but rather just a little bit preoccupied or maybe a little avoidant. But this is not the case when it's a disorganized situation. That is, when the other parent is the source of terror, that needs to be stopped, because that is a real serious impediment. And my colleagues and I just had a big meeting up at Berkeley, for I think it was almost a week we were together, really looking at disorganized attachment and its long-term impacts without therapy on the individual. And so if you see that, that's a different sort of thing that really necessitates, I think, some clinical intervention. But if you do, Power of Showing Up or do Parenting from the Inside Out with your spouse, assuming you're collaborative, people can start to learn, like, oh, I see. So I've seen a number of parents where that's the case. And with the neutrality, in quotes, of a book and the science behind it, and if it's a real science person who's, being dismissive or whatever, have them read The Developing Mind. And I've had quite a few academics who, really want to see the science. So they read The Developing Mind and they'll come to me and say, oh my gosh, I don't know what was going on with me, but I never believed any of that stuff. But now that I see the science, I'm a believer. So I've had some very interesting moments like that with professors and chair people of different departments who fought me tooth and nail about how attachment is unimportant. And I just say, because 20% of the population will say that. And if they're in academics, they will debate you till the end, tell you parents have no impact on children. And it's so unscientific what these scientists say. But 20% of the population, that's the way they survive. So as a therapist, I go, oh, poor person, that was their way of doing it. But when they go out sort of trying to manifest that in the world and take away funding from programs that are trying to support parents in need, then you have to step up and defend those parents.
Thank you. Another question here from Carla about any advice you could give for special needs parents and how they feel. She says, I feel everything very personally. Being a special needs parent has even torn that more open.
Wow. So for her, is special needs, do you mean that you as an adult have a neuro, what's called atypical development? So you have special needs, or that your child has not a typical neural development, so it's called neural atypical, and that's what you mean. So I don't know which way, because it's a little bit different how I respond.
Your own child.
Of the child, okay.
Child.
So it depends, Marion Sigmund was such a dear and such a wonderful, I hope some of you got the privilege of knowing Marion. She, with her colleagues, at the time when I was her trainee, showed that kids with autism have the normal distribution, the regular distribution of attachment. So it's very clear autism, or being on the autistic spectrum, is not caused by what parents do. It's not something that is a blockage of attachment, so that it's just expressed behaviorally in a different way. And her fantastic work, she published this, I think it was in 1992. The publication came out, and it really blew everyone away, because it just said kids with autism have a regular distribution of attachment. It's just manifested differently. And that really was encouraging for parents, first of all, to realize it's not caused by attachment. And secondly, to see the special way. So when you say a special needs kid, the 4 S's and the 5th of sense making, they apply to everyone, including neuroatypical kids, and including neuroatypical kids who are on the autism spectrum. So you just have to find your way of sensing into what this particular child needs, and the way their sensory integration challenges are, or their emotional regulation challenges are, or even their mindset challenges. You can still work with them at this level.
Thank you, Dan. I noticed the hour is getting late, but here's one last question. How do you promote attachment to others and being present when so many connections are being made right now on Zoom?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I've got to say, because I'm doing all my therapy on this platform, online because of COVID-19, and the therapy is going great. And it's with, some are patients who I've been seeing for years, and we've just transitioned to this, and so you'd say, of course it's going to go well. But even with people I've never seen before. So it's like, wow. I mean, the sessions get really deep. The work is really profound. And I've never met them physically in person. So in terms of therapists, I'm okay with it. I'm also, even though I know there was an article back in, I think, April or May, in the New York Times saying Zoom is bad for us, because there's a little bit of a lag. And what I try to do, and these are little things you could do, is when you're talking to someone one-on-one, bring the window as close so that the eyes of the person you're having a conversation with are near your camera. So even though you're going to look into their eyes, you physically made it so this is what I do for my patients. So I'm actually looking in their eyes, yes, but the camera is super close to where I put their eyes. So what my patients say is it's as if I'm looking them in the eyes. And, there are all these, if you just give it a little space, because on Zoom especially, the audio has a abrupt switch between one and the other. That's why on our We community pep talks, we do it on Crowdcast, because we actually can blend the audio. So that's why I've chosen that. But short of that, it's actually pretty good. What I would suggest is that you make sure the body is moving a lot so that we're not just sitting. And that you realize that, the mind is fully embodied and it's fully relational. And so if you start applying what I call, reflective dialogues to your Zoom calls, where in other words, you put to words the internal world of the mind. And if you just remember the acronym SIFT, I know I'm giving you all these acronyms, so, sorry about that. Some people hate acronyms, and my apologies. Some people love them, so I'm glad you love them. But sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. So when you do SIFT, so if I'm talking to a friend on Zoom and, she's saying something really painful that went on, let's say with her mother, and I'm feeling choked up in my throat, and she can't really see it because she's not physically with me, but I'll say, wow, I'm really choked up here. Or, oh God, I feel really tight in my belly. Or, I'm breathing really fast. I will actually use words to articulate that. And, as Matt Lieberman and others at UCLA showed, and I like to use the phrase, when you can name it to tame it. So you can use words to articulate what's going on inside, and it lets you become more balanced out in your emotion regulation. But I think if we started doing reflective dialogues, basically building mind sight, and if you use Brainstorm, the book for adolescents has these gray pages that teach you how to do this, you could actually make your Zoom calls a wonderful way of building reflective skills. So you build your mind sight abilities, which is really the basis, as Dan Goleman has said in the foreword to the Mind Sight book, the basis for social emotional intelligence. And it's something you can build at any age. And I think we can build it online. We just have to make sure we're building mind sight into our communication in this format. But I think it's doable.
I think that's wonderful advice, and something that we can all begin to practice as we are all Zooming on many meetings, and that's our way of interacting right now with our friends and family and colleagues. So thank you so much for sharing your vast knowledge and expertise with our audience, for taking the time from what I know is a very busy day for you to be with us for the 5th time. And I'm sorry we can't give you a Saturday Night Live type jacket, but we'll try to find something to commemorate your 5th appearance, and look forward to the 6th.
Great. So thank you so much, Vicki. Thanks for your wonderful work, and thanks to your whole team, and thanks to everyone for being here. We're in this literally together, and together we can make this a better world. So thanks for inviting me to be here with you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And stay safe, stay well, and we'll look forward to seeing you on October 1st. We have a special open mind on COVID-19 and mental health, moderated by Dr. Thomas Strauss, who's the medical director of the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital. So I hope you'll all join us then. And thank you very much, Dr. Siegel.
Thank you, Vicki.
Good night.
Good night.